I would like to talk very briefly, very briefly, about the 19th century in China, and in particular, the theme of unrest as a result of contact from the outside. And this is putting this into Chinese historical perspective. China, from its own conception, has always been the center of the world. It's called Zhongmu. It's the Middle Kingdom. It's the center of the civilized world. The Chinese emperor is the son of heaven, not of just the skies over China, but all of heaven. China, from the Chinese perspective, up until the middle of the 19th century and beyond, is the world, the civilized world. All the other non-Chinese groups on the periphery are barbarous to a certain extent. But in the 19th century, the Chinese encountered non-Chinese people whom they not only could not best militarily, but who possessed academic and cultural institutions that they perceived as a threat to their own. And this is something that had never happened before. The Chinese had contacts with Roman and Byzantine officials, but these were distant empires. The Persian Empire was a distant empire, even India. Now the Chinese were face to face with people who were technological and cultural peers, and this is something that had never happened, and it caused quite a shock. Economically, however, China remained in its prominent position. This is due to the fact that Chinese goods, particularly porcelain, tea, silk, were very highly valued by the entire globe. While in China, foreign goods were not held with such esteem, particularly European goods. The European goods that were valued in China, aside from weapons, were wool, which China could produce itself in abundance in its northwestern provinces, and salted fish, which China could also produce in abundance. In terms of other consumer goods, European wine was looked at as kind of a novelty, but it wasn't really valued because it didn't fit the Chinese palate. So when the British ambassador, Lord George Macartney, appeared before the Qianlong Emperor and requested that the Qing Empire open up trade between China and Britain, the Qianlong Emperor decided against it. He felt that the British had very little to offer. And so what happened was that silver continued to leave Europe, Britain, France, Germany, etc., and flow into China. So wealth was accumulating in China, as it had always done, as a result of these Chinese goods being sold abroad. Well, this caused consternation in Great Britain. By this point, the British had become heavy tea drinkers, and tea was produced in India and in China. And tea had originally been cultivated in China, and for a long time, for a period of about 2,000 years, the export of how to produce tea was a state secret, in which if it was found that you showed a foreigner how to produce tea, you would be put to death. Well, in the southern port of Guangzhou, you had various European nations gathering to trade, and they were exporting tea back to Europe. And of course, to pay for this tea, they didn't have goods of their own that the Chinese wanted, so they were paying for it with silver and gold. So precious metals were flowing into China. They were making China wealthier, Europe poorer. The British wanted to redress what they considered to be an imbalance of trade. And they did this by attempting to import into China a drug concocted from a poppy plant, which was grown in British India. And that drug is opium, which is an opiate, similar to heroin, OxyContin, all of the opiate painkillers. and it was highly addictive. And so suddenly in China, where you have centuries and centuries of filial piety, if you remember that virtue, very, very, very strong family ties, very, very strong collectivist cultural norms. Suddenly you had children being abandoned by their parents. You had fathers leaving their families. You had all kinds of marital strife between generations. In a society that had traditionally prized being harmonious socially, the Qing government began to investigate, and they uncovered the first opiate epidemic in history. In southern China, in particular, they were seeing the development of slums, of crime, of all of the attenuate harms that come from the spread of a very powerful drug that people didn't know how to contain. People didn't understand addiction at this time, even in China. Alcoholism was understood. The Chinese used kudzu to treat alcoholism traditionally, and it's been found to still be very effective. Taking kudzu supplements is used to reduce the urge to drink. If you've ever heard of the drug Antabuse, the modern anti-alcoholism drug, it's kind of similar in that respect to how traditional Chinese medicine uses kudzu. But they couldn't grasp the severity of addiction to opium. It was something that was completely new, and it absolutely ravaged southern Chinese society. And this is in part due to the fact that advances in scientific chemistry had rendered a much more lethal substance than the traditional ways of using a poppy plant. So the Qing government sent one of the country's most prominent policemen, Lin Zexu, who's now considered a hero in China, to arrest all of the opium dealers. The opium dealers were put to death, the Chinese opium dealers, and the opium was thrown into the sea. Opium was outlawed, and the world's first anti-drug legislation was passed. The British merchants responsible for bringing in the opium were angry that their cargo had been seized by the Chinese government and destroyed. In particular, they were angry that the Chinese government was threatening to actually put them to death for bringing opium into the country in the future. Lin Zexu then sends a letter to Queen Victoria in Britain, in which he essentially says, hey, we're putting these people to death for bringing this harmful drug into our country. Imagine if we did this to you. Imagine if China took opium, brought it into Britain, and distributed it to British people. And British men, women, and children were dying by the thousands because of this harmful drug. So he was trying to importune her to stop this trade, to stop the British merchants from bringing in this harmful narcotic. Instead of limiting the activities of these merchants, Parliament ended up declaring war, and Great Britain went to war with the Qing dynasty to protect these essentially drug dealers. This is one of the first of many of what the Chinese call national humiliations. Events imposed from outside by Western powers, and particularly by Japan, that they see as historic grievances. And it's easy to see why, given the character of the First and Second Opium Wars. We're talking about the First Opium War here. So the British Navy completely destroyed the Chinese fleet. British soldiers occupied the city of Canton, and the Qing government was forced to sue for peace. The resulting peace treaty was the Treaty of Nanking, which was one of the most humiliating peace treaties in Chinese history, given the subject of the war. I just said Nanjing. The treaty was very, very, very harsh. China had to pay an indemnity, a huge indemnity that covered the cost of Britain in the war. They had to allow for the spread of this odious substance. And even worse, the British gained the right of extraterritoriality, which meant that if you were a British merchant and you committed a crime in China, you got to be tried by a British court, not a Chinese court. And this was very, very humiliating because this goes right to the definition of sovereignty. We give a modern example of this principle. In the 1990s, there was an American student who had vandalized some cars in Singapore. Singapore has a Han Chinese majority, so it has a significant Indian and Malay minority. But in Singapore, there's corporal punishment. You can be caned for committing certain crimes. And this American was sentenced to a caning. And there were those in the American government who wanted to get this kid out of this punishment. And the Singaporean government, being of predominantly Chinese origin, brought up this grievance of extraterritoriality, and arguing that the Westerners are always trying to come here and violate laws and don't want to accept our punishments. So our country accept our punishments. And of course it backfired for the U.S. government when many in the American public expressed a desire for the caning to be implemented in the United States due to the fact that the country was experiencing a massive crime wave in the early 90s at the time. But this was a very, very sore point for decades afterwards. And finally, the British were given sovereignty over the island of Hong Kong, which at the time was a very, very small fishing village that would later develop into a very large metropolis, the Hong Kong we have today, and all of the conflict that is involved in contemporary Hong Kong. Hong Kong now has been reverted to China. It reverted in 1997, and there's a lot of conflict over whether or not the Hong Kongers get to keep some elements of their British laws. To pay for the cost of the war, for the defeat, the Qing government raised taxes, which in turn caused rents to skyrocket, which in turn led to internal strife. As a result of the Opium War, direct result, you have the Taiping Rebellion. And the Taiping Rebellion is the most brutal civil war in the history of the world. It's considered either the second or third most brutal war in the history of the world. It's estimated that 20 up to even 50 million people died as a result of this war. It was primarily a rebellion in southern China, and it was started by a man named Hong Xiuquan, who wanted to be a government official, but kept failing his exams. Eventually, he came into contact with Western missionaries who taught him about Christianity. So he got the bright idea of teaching that he was the younger brother of Jesus, and that he had been called to remake Chinese society completely from top to bottom, to overthrow the Qing. The Qing, if you remember from previous lecture, they were Manchu ethnically. They were not Han Chinese. And because of this, they began to be seen as foreign by the southern Chinese. So it was an ethnic movement, a movement to drive out what were considered foreign rulers. And the Taiping rebels, when they encountered Manchus, they ruthlessly slaughtered them. And the Qing government, in response, ruthlessly slaughtered the Taiping rebels whenever they were captured. Hong Xiuquan taught a doctrine of kind of radical equalism. The idea was that private property would be abandoned. Everything would be owned communally. The state would redistribute land to peasants away from the Manchus, who were hated. And he believed in the equality of men and women. He wanted to end foot binding, which was a practice in which, a traditional practice that began in the late Tang Dynasty, 1,300 years earlier, or 1,100 years earlier, rather, in which a young girl's feet would be bound in wrapping, and it would eventually break the arch of the foot and lead to what were called lotus feet. Very, very small, delicate feet. And really it was a sign that you were wealthy enough that your wife didn't have to work. For 95% of society, Chinese women had to go out and labor in the fields and in the factories and in the shops. By having these foot bindings, it was a sign of elite status. And of course, it was women who were instituting these foot bindings on their daughters because it was a sign that you were elite, you were sophisticated and wealthy, and you had high status. But they wanted to outlaw this practice. They wanted to outlaw prostitution, and they wanted to completely eradicate opium. Keep in mind, this rebellion began in southern China, the same part of China where opium began to spread. To add to the humiliation of the Qing government, the Qing had to rely on Western military commanders to train Chinese troops to defeat the Taiping rebels using modern military tactics. And that was considered kind of a salt in the wound from the Opium War. But ultimately, the Qing government was able to defeat the rebels after the death of Hong Qiuquan, and the rebellion was ultimately destroyed at a horrendous cost of human life. At minimum, 20 million deaths, possibly up to 50 million. Despite the fact that the Taiping rebellion was destroyed, the resentment against the Qing and against foreign elements would continue, culminating in 1900 in the Boxer Rebellion, which you may have heard of. This was a rebellion launched by ethnic Han Chinese commoners who formed a secret society called the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fist, which is why the English word boxers was used. Their symbol was a fist. And their goal was to rise up and drive out foreign occupiers who were seen as, walking around with extraterritoriality, committing crimes, and the Chinese government, the Qing government, was completely corrupt at the time, headed by the Empress Dowager, Cixi. Cixi was very, very powerful. She controlled the government for 30 years, but during her reign, China stagnated. It fell behind, further and further behind European powers militarily, economically, and at first, she was against the Boxers, then she supported the Boxers, but then she ultimately had to stand by while foreign militaries, including Americans and Japanese troops, crushed the Boxer Rebellion. And this is another of China's great humiliations. If you look at this cartoon here on the left, you can see the different European powers, including, in addition to Japan, carving up China, while the Chinese official in the background throws a fit. You can see on the far right what a Boxer rebel looked like. Okay, so again, to summarize, this is a period of humiliation that would ultimately result in providing strength for a communist insurgency that would ultimately take over the entire country, with the exception of the island of Taiwan, and would form the People's Republic of China, which would belong in another lecture.